I'm Denise Phillip. I'm the content analyst for Duarte.com. We're coming to you live from the African Utility Week studio. And with us today, we have got Tony Duarte, and you are the microgrid manager specifically for the southern region of Africa.
That's
from ABB. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for
How are you finding the event so far?
No, very good. It's a good, it's good, how can I say, exposure for ABB, and there's a lot of interesting opportunities out there.
Fantastic.
It's great.
So your focus is on microgrids, clearly. So Africa is just, it's a continent filled to the brim with natural resources, but yet there still seems to be a problem as far as access to electricity is concerned, mostly because of transmission and distribution issues. How can microgrids fix this for Africa?
Yeah, so obviously the current situation in Africa is that there's about 600 million people that have absolutely no access to electricity. And one way of solving that problem is to maybe introduce microgrids, simply for the fact that microgrids are integratable a lot quicker than any traditional source of electricity, being conventional generation or anything like that. So essentially microgrids is an enabler that brings quick sources of generation together, balances them, and supplies, for instance, rural communities in Africa for quick power and all that in a short period of time.
Why aren't there more of these around?
I think the concept is pretty new. I mean, if I talk on the ABB side, we've been in the game for over 25 years in microgrids already. But in terms of industry and technology, it seems to be still a very new concept. So governments in different countries are still gearing themselves towards these opportunities, and it'll take some time to get themselves up to scratch on what the microgrid concept can offer them and how quick.
Right. And as far as sectors is concerned, are we speaking more about on a residential side or commercial and industrial? You can just tell us where the trend is at the moment, the need for the microgrid.
Sure. Essentially the main focus is commercial and industrial, mining as well. But once we start moving into residential, we rather look at it as a community point of view, rather than each household having their own solar producing plant or something like that. So we'd rather look at it as a community, because it's easier to integrate in that way.
Absolutely. And from a commercial and industrial perspective, are these microgrids, are they eventually linked up to the central grid, or is this complete self-generation, completely off the grid?
Yeah, look, a microgrid is both non-grid connected and grid connected. Mm-hmm. If it's connected to the grid, it's mostly for augmentation or stabilizing of the grid, for the local grid. It's not actually exporting back onto the main grid, because there are obviously regulation issues and all that you need to contend with. So the emphasis is more, and that's what the microgrid, a typical characteristic of a microgrid is, it's generation that's normally close to the consumer of power. That's probably one of the key points of a microgrid. The other key point of a microgrid is that when you compare it to a normal national grid, is it can isolate itself from the main grid, so it can island itself. Yeah. So those are the most important features of a microgrid.
Where are the most exciting markets at the moment? Which countries are really looking to develop their microgrids?
Well, so if you look at the southern African region, probably the most interesting countries that we're looking at is Zambia, Kenya, Mozambique a little bit. So those are pretty much. Namibia is also doing their thing, but mostly Zambia. Zambia is probably the highest priority country right now.
Why? What's driving the need?
They've got total lack of power. They're dependent on other countries to supply them with power. They've got their own power generation, but it's not enough and it's not consistent at this stage. So they're facing a lot of load shedding as we speak. And maybe the microgrid approach or renewables, for even that matter, might solve them that problem quickly.
And in Zambia, is it again the commercial, industrial areas that are desperate for a reliable source of power?
Yeah, so in Zambia, essentially the mines don't really get suppressed or get exposed to load shedding. It's more the commercial and industrial guys, but it's also not all of them. And then mostly the residential areas, they get load shedded consistently on a daily basis.
And where are we getting the money for this? Is there a lot of private investment, flocking in, or is it more local investment? What do you find at the moment is the trend?
Yeah, so essentially we know very well that most of the African governments don't have the necessary funds to invest in these projects. So the normal approach is for IPPs, independent power producers, to offer them these projects and sell the power at a certain tariff, obviously market related.
Right.
So obviously the IPP would have to go and source their own funding, and most of this funding is international funding, it's global funding.
Okay. And for utilities, what opportunities are there for them to get involved with microgrid development?
Yeah, so in terms of the utility side, we've got, for instance, substations that are supplying power to communities. Often these powers, obviously there's always development in communities, they're growing and all that, and the substations tend to become too small, or the design cannot supply the demand anymore. So microgrids, there's a way in microgrids that we can supplement that peak demand management for minutes or seconds in order to defer investment in substations, because if you take the costs of upgrading a substation, upgrading the transmission line, transmission substation, it's a lot more than just putting down maybe a battery solution or something to the sort that will supplement that demand for just that little period of time.
Okay. Are there any particular really exciting projects that you are dealing with right now where perhaps the opportunities are great or the potential has already been realized? Have you got any examples like that for us currently?
Well, probably the closest one to home is our own head office at ABB in Edenvale, in Longmeadow, in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
So what we're doing there, we're fully integrating ABB head office into a microgrid. So what we've done basically is we've installed PV solar on the roofs, about 750 kilowatts of solar PV. We've installed the battery system, and we've got the diesel, and we still have the grid from City Power. So essentially the whole concept works in the sense that we've got the load, and then we've got the battery just behind it. And what the battery is creating is creating a seamless changeover of power on its input side. So we've got the PV power, grid, diesel, battery itself on the back, and whatever they're doing in the background has no effect on the load in the front. So, and yes, we obviously know that battery systems are quite expensive. So what we as ABB tend to do is we try and size the battery system in such a way that it can take up load for a minute or a few seconds, long enough for other sources of generation to come in. So when we're talking of virtual grid mode, so the grid has fallen away, the battery takes over the load.
Right.
And basically, if it's got PV power to supplement that full load, so be it. But if it doesn't, it's got enough charge to enable the diesel gens to come on load and supplement the rest of the power.
Fantastic. All right. Now, the microgrids that you were discussing, perhaps in Zambia, for instance,
Yes.
and what sources of power is the microgrid drawing? Is it majority renewable, or is it a good mixture, a hybrid mix?
So one of the concepts in ABB's microgrid approach is that we try and switch all diesels off,
Yeah.
or all non-essential or let's say erratic power off. So we try and distance ourselves or island ourselves from the grid if required. So these are small pockets of microgrids. We're not designing a microgrid to power a whole city like Lusaka or something like that. Instead, we are creating little microgrids all over the place where you're supplying for that portion of the grid. Because it's very important that once you start increasing the evacuation requirement for a grid, the grid needs to be able to do that. Otherwise, you have to upgrade the grid as well. So we look at more a decentralized mode of putting PV plants all over the place, and they actually essentially all interconnected with each other and supplying power to a single grid.
Fantastic. Perhaps a bit of a controversial question, but I'll ask it regardless. The microgrid in Africa, is it a threat or an opportunity for utilities going forward?
No, it's definitely an opportunity. The sense being that, let's take an example of a microgrid itself that's connected to the grid. Now, say the microgrid has got the battery system. Now, essentially when we talk of the way we charge or discharge a battery system, we talk of a term called energy arbitrage. Now, what that essentially means is that you are charging the battery when tariffs are very low, and we are discharging the battery when tariffs are very high. So what that means is there's two benefits to the utility now. So when it's peak period, you're actually using the batteries to discharge power into the grid. It means that the utility has got surplus of power to distribute somewhere else.
Right.
So you've got less load shedding in peak periods. That's essentially what we experience in South Africa during peak times, or during peak load shedding times as well. The other thing is that when everybody's sleeping from 10 o'clock onwards till say 4 o'clock in the morning, nobody's actually consuming that power. But because you've got battery systems installed now, you're actually consuming power. You're creating a revenue stream for the utilities as well.
Yeah.
So there's essentially two benefits that microgrids bring to a utility.
All right. My final question to you.
Sure.
Any final advice you want to give to utilities and perhaps even private investors when it comes to microgrid development in Africa?
Sure. I mean, just by the fact that you're increasing the access to electricity opens a whole new world of technology, a lot of more opportunities, the development of communities and all that. So there are three essential objectives that a microgrid wants to achieve. The first one is security of power. The second is achieving the lowest LCOE, so levelized cost of energy at any one time, day or night. So when we talk of microgrids, we don't normally only talk about solar being in the microgrid. We talk of any type, because the microgrid is essentially generation agnostic. So it can integrate any type of generation together. And then lastly, which might become quite a crucial point, is the reduction of the carbon footprint. So those are the three objectives that are microgrid. So for investors and all that, that should be the approach to any end customer that requires electricity.
Tony, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. I'm Denise from Duarte.